Before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge that we are presently located on the traditional lands of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. The name Toronto means meeting place, as this region was also the meeting place of many other First Nation peoples who use this land. Good evening. My name is Jeff Kugler. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Urban Schooling here at OISE. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for this forum. Over the last couple of years, the forum has had a focus on urban Aboriginal educational issues in partnership with the TDSB Aboriginal Education Centre. We see these forums as an important opportunity to bring to light important educational issues that impact the struggles for equity and social justice in education within the Canadian context. This evening, we are thrilled to have our forum titled From Chicago to Toronto, Educational Activism in Increasingly Conservative Times. And I guess for most people in this room, yesterday might have been a moment that reflects a not so conservative time. And we could give a cheer. It'll be better when he's finally gone. Absolutely. And we are thrilled that this Center for Urban Schooling Forum is co-sponsored by other educational activist organizations. The initial idea for this forum actually came from James Campbell from the organization Educators for Peace and Justice. You have to stand up, not sit down. James. Who spoke with us at the Center for Urban Schooling last winter about the possibility of such a forum on educational activism. After that, we met with others, and out of many, many, many planning meetings, we are very happy that you are all here tonight to begin to continue the important discussions on educator activism in increasingly conservative times. This evening is organized in partnership with several organizations, Educators for Peace and Justice, the Elementary Teachers of Toronto, and the Provincial Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. We're thrilled with this partnership. So thanks to those organizations. At the time we were organizing for this evening, the situation in Ontario schools was slightly different. We did not have Bill 115, a Putting Students First Act, a name which could not be further from the truth. Hear, hear. We are very happy that this forum will include important discussions connected on how to build progressive social justice-focused unions. Unions that see the injustices that occur in schools connected to race, class, gender, and sexual orientation as important union issues. It's my belief that the battles connected to building progressive unions must center the fight against the systemic injustices and barriers that exist in our schools for racialized and marginalized students. Centering those students lays the foundation for creating true community support for education workers of all kinds. But this evening is not solely focused on educators and their unions. While the fight within our unions is one form of educator activism, there are many other places and spaces for teachers and educational workers to be activists, including our schools, classrooms, and communities. Tonight, we're fortunate to hear from activists engaged in many forms of educational activism. We see this evening as a chance to share, to listen, to hopefully be inspired, and to gain strength from and through each other and our numbers. We see this evening as a chance to broaden our understandings and to make contact with others doing similar work to ourselves or doing something that might inspire us to try something different or new. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Vanessa Russell from the Center for Urban Schooling, who will introduce tonight's panel and moderate the discussion. The focus is working to answer the following question. What are the roles of educational activists within their classrooms, schools, communities, and unions in responding to the challenges we all face in increasingly conservative times? And hopefully this discussion will lead to new connections, new learnings, and most importantly, new actions. Thank you.
I too would like to welcome everyone here tonight. It's exciting to have such a big group of people. First off, I want you just to take a look at the information boards at the back of the library, labeled Union, Classroom, School, Community Resources and Actions. During the course of the evening, at organic moments that will not be too disruptive, hopefully, write down events and organizations that you feel folks in this room should know about. You have 2 blank sticky notes for this purpose that were included with your agenda, and there are markers provided near the boards at the back. Make sure to include your contact information so we can continue tonight's conversation and build an informal network. So an overview of the evening really quickly. In the first hour, we're going to hear from our distinguished panelists. Immediately following the panel, we'll have about half an hour for a Q&A, and I'll describe that process later after the panel. Next, we're going to be engaging in a speed activism exercise where I promise you'll have opportunities to meet a lot of people in the room. This activity will be described to you a little bit later. And for now, just don't move the chairs around or take the little sticky notes off of the end chairs in the aisle. So I'd like to now introduce you to our 4 panelists. Starting with Jackson Potter, who is right beside me. Jackson Potter is a Chicago public school graduate. He was a high school activist who led a walkout at Whitney Young in 1995 to push for equal funding for schools in Illinois. After college, he worked at Inglewood High School and was the union delegate there when former CEO Arne Duncan called the school a culture of failure and started a phase-out in 2005. Potter then began to resist corporate school reform, joined a rank-and-file group of teachers, and formed the Renaissance 2010 committee with the Chicago Teachers Union. He fought to give teachers a right to sit at the table with the CUE, Chicagoans United for Education Coalition, before the Chicago Teachers Union dismantled it. He formed the Caucus of Rank-and-File Educators, CORE, in May 2008, and the grassroots education movement with community organizations shortly thereafter. In June 2010, CORE won the general election for the leadership of the CTU, the 3rd largest teachers local in the country. Jackson currently serves the CTU as the staff coordinator. Next to Jackson is Tim McCaskell, a longtime Toronto writer, activist, and educator. For more than 20 years, he worked at the Toronto Board of Education, the Toronto District School Board, developing and delivering anti-racism, anti-homophobia, and anti-sexual harassment programs with students and teachers. He is presently a member of the Toronto District School Board's Equity Policy Advisory Committee, EPAC, and a member of the Community Council for the Triangle Program, Canada's only public school program for LGBTQ youth. He received the City of Toronto Award of Merit for his human rights work in 1996. In 2005, he published Race to Equity, Disrupting Educational Inequality, a history of the struggle of equity in Toronto public schools. Word on the street is he's working on another book. You can talk to him about that later. Monica Rosas is sitting kind of far from me, is an educator, agitator, artist whose work aims to challenge and provoke community discussion on gender, race, and the environment in compassionate ways. She has traveled and worked with youth in Colombia, Cuba, and Toronto, teaching English, drama, and social sciences, champion a student-centered, equity-driven educational philosophy rooted in participatory action and restorative practices. Recently, Monica has been a member of the Proyecto Latino project, acting as an educator liaison between the University of Toronto and the Toronto District School Board, as well as a volunteer researcher and co-facilitator of its youth participatory action phase. Monica is also an active community organizer with the Latin American community in Toronto and has been involved in various arts and community building projects focusing on women and youth, including being the literary and education director of the Salvador Allende Festival in 2009. She is currently a staff member at Alpha 2 Alternative School and was a co-recipient of the Ken Spencer Teaching and Innovation Award in 2010. And finally, Nigel Barriffe, who is such a busy activist. I got his bio about 10 minutes ago. Nigel Barriffe is a Toronto District School Board elementary teacher serving the Rexdale area. He was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and immigrated to Canada with his family as a young child. Nigel attained his Master of Education degree with the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies in Education at OISE through the Urban Education cohort. His primary focus lies with building a social base for a more just educational system and entails a thorough analysis of related issues, including building community participation in school board decision-making and the development of an engaging and purposeful curriculum for all children, including children of African Canadian and Caribbean heritage. Nigel is a community activist and organizer concerned with social justice and environmental issues. Locally, he strives to improve his school and community environment in an effort to create sustainable changes and reduce the carbon footprint of his students. On a broader scale, Nigel's goal is to educate and raise awareness about environmental policies and innovative programs, social and ecological responsibility, and to increase political engagement and public consultation within his community. Currently, he is board chair of Education Attainment West, board member of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, a member of numerous environmental research committees, and member of the Good Jobs for All Coalition and Community Organizing for Responsible Development. Nigel's work in community organizing has centered on quality public education, good green jobs, anti-racism, and a more just society for all inside and outside of the classroom. His work in these areas has been recognized through a number of awards, including the 2012 J.S. Woodsworth Award, the 2012 Toronto Community News Urban Hero Award, and the 2011 Urban Alliance on Race Relations Service Award. Please give a warm welcome to the panelists. And we'll be starting with Jackson.
Good evening. How's everyone doing out there? Good? All right. There's some chairs up here if people need seats. I want to start by just saying it's an honor to be here. I'm struck by the similarities in the fights that we're all facing across the continent and throughout the world in education. But there is also significant differences based on our particularities and our unique circumstances. So take all I say with a grain of salt as we go through this. I arrived in the country on Sunday, and the customs officer began asking me a litany of questions. Why are you here? Well, I'm a teacher. I'm visiting teachers here. Well, if you're a teacher, how come you're not teaching this week? And so I began wondering, well, is the CIA like setting me up as I try and enter Canada? And he kept asking more and more questions about who exactly am I meeting with? Do I have a letter from them? And then he says suddenly, well, my wife's an elementary school teacher, and they need your help. So on my way out of the country tomorrow, I will try and find him and say, I want to bring your elementary school teachers to my country to teach us how to get rid of our mayor, because that's quite remarkable. the way I want to set up tonight's talk is I'm going to go through a brief history of the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, our rank and file group that took our union by storm, and talk a little bit of how we developed our program and approach, because I know there's people in the audience who are very interested in that. And then I'm going to go into how we translated that vision once we became the union leadership into reality, using the union as an institution and a vehicle for our goals and objectives. So I was a delegate at Englewood High School, which was labeled the homicide capital of the country as a community by the New York Times in the 1980s. And I came in because our star basketball player was murdered on school grounds. And this is in 2002, 2003 school year. And I replaced the dean of students, who was a well-renowned black basketball coach who had a tremendous respect of the students. And he had actually gone to Englewood as a student when, in the 1950s, it was about 3,000 students, almost all African American by the end of the decade. They had one security officer at the front of the building to just monitor off-campus lunch as students exited and entered the building throughout the day. By the time I'm a teacher there were about 2 full-time Chicago police officers, 16 full-time security guards, a complicated camera system that circumnavigated the block, used with anti-poverty funds that was purchased with. And, you know, we're a culture of failure, so the question is it teachers that suddenly became terrible teachers in this period, or was it the loss of steel mills and the stockyards and the tremendous dislocation and deindustrialization that, you know, bludgeoned the community repeatedly over decades? I think you know what the answer would be, kind of implied by the way I'm characterizing it. A recent study showed, a longitudinal study of students in LA, that a student that has 6 indicators of abuse in their life, you know, verbal abuse, child abuse, etc., and has a dysfunctional family situation, is 4,600% times more likely to be an intravenous drug user than their counterparts. So this boogeyman of teachers and their unions is absurd, outrageous, and it's a smokescreen for what's really happening throughout the world, which is increasing disparities in wealth and income, an austerity approach that seeks to blame the public sector for the follies of the market, and we've got to call it what it is. And part of what we did was do that, so I'm going to walk through it a little bit. The vice president of the union comes into my school the day after the closing's announced and says, you know, there's nothing you can do. You know, pack your bags, get your resume ready. And that was a toxic message, because it was based in this understanding of unions as strictly adhering to a contract. You know, these are your rights. Any managerial powers outside of this book are off limits. We have no power over those things. And what we decided as rank and file activists is that message was unacceptable. That an institution with deep roots in the community, with thousands of members, with vital relationships with parents, was unable to make that leap in how to fight school closing, something so fundamental to its own existence as a union. And we had to do something about it. So we began to fight these school closings. The union's approach was this field of dreams strategy. You know, this Kevin Costner film where you build this magical field and the baseball players just show up. It's this idea that you call a protest and magically your members will arrive. And it's based in this faulty notion that people don't somehow have a rationalization about their role in the union that's independent and unique, and that you have to actually talk to them and get a sense of where they're coming from and figure out what makes them tick and see if they're even engaged or if they're alienated. You know, we mistake apathy for we see apathy and it's really alienation, or that people feel their needs aren't being met, and we don't do the work necessary to really get to the bottom of that. And so what we started doing was having organizing conversations with members across our city. You know, what's going on in your school? You know, how does the problems that you're describing connect with these different events that we're trying to build where we're pushing back on these policies? How can you get involved? Oh, I don't feel like I can get involved. And just kind of walking them through their fears and concerns and really having that organizing discussion. We also called the school closings what they were, racist attacks on neighborhood schools. It was almost all concentrated in the black community of Chicago. And there was also a racial disparate impact on the teachers, because overwhelmingly the teachers targeted were black teachers who were going back to the communities that they grew up in because they felt a calling to reach out to the students that were most underserved in their city. And so we, protested Arne Duncan, and we filed Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaints on behalf of black teachers. Now, granted, the union wasn't doing this. We were doing it as rank-and-file activists because they weren't, and we felt it was necessary. We tried to get them to do it, but when it turned out after a couple years that they weren't going to change in their direction, we decided to do it ourselves. And that translated, when we took over the union, we started calling many of these schools apartheid schools, because that's essentially what they are. We also went to every single hearing that was a public hearing about school closings, and we talked to parents at those hearings. We got names and numbers. We developed a database that wasn't just teachers, but was parents, community activists, people in other unions. Anybody who was willing to listen and play a role, they started coming to our meetings and becoming part of the group. We also began doing more labor solidarity and community outreach. And this entailed taking risks. So we established partnerships with a variety of community groups who were militantly opposed to school closings that didn't take into account their community's interests or input. And we started camping out in February, bitter cold, with community activists to get into board meetings that were once a month, held early in the morning, and you had to get there that early in order to sign up, even though it wasn't until 10:30, so you had to take a day off work. It was extremely inconvenient, and they would ordinarily stack the line with bureaucrats so that they would prevent people from being able to speak. So, we had to adjust our tactics. When we became part of the union, our community allies said, you guys have got to march on the mayor. And this was a time when Rahm Emanuel had, a 75% approval rating. And he lives in this very elite community that's quiet, and everybody has flowers on their porches, and, nobody messes with that area. And they wanted to march, 500 black and Latino low-income families down the street with Occupy Chicago, which had just started bubbling up, and all these anarchists with bandanas. So we were freaked out by this prospect as a union. But because of that praxis that we had, and because it wasn't a transactional relationship of, we'll give you some money if you come to our event kind of thing, but it was a real relationship of, let's debate and argue what are the best approaches to fighting these policies. And if we win the argument, then fair enough. And if you win the argument, then we have to go with what the group decides. And so we took that risk, and it was one of the most powerful things we ever did. Imagine 500 black and Latino students, parents, teachers together with stickers on their face that said silenced, and candles, and we sung civil rights songs. We're not going to let anybody turn us around. Education is a human right. And it was powerful, and it hit the media, and it really tilted the discussion in a whole different area. So it was a risk well worth taking. We did a lot more outreach and agitation with the membership. What are we doing here? This is an existential crisis. We used our passion, our knowledge. We got to the nub of what bothered them, but then we tried to redirect the conversation around, well, how do we attack these forces that are responsible for all of the pain and suffering we're seeing in our schools and all of the disrespect we're seeing for educators? And we listened. We didn't just try and be salesmen, but we tried to inspire. Imagine if Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail said, God, this is hopeless. This system of white supremacy is deeply rooted, and there's never going to be a way to fight against it. Well, we'd be all still living in Jim Crow conditions in the southern United States. But instead, the civil rights movement took on this system and overthrew it. And I think we have to take on a similar perspective, that neoliberal corporate school reform isn't going to stop anytime soon. And it's a protracted struggle, and our hope and inspiration have to be continually embedded in how we talk to people, or else we will falter and feel dispossessed and very demobilized. So we had critical conversations. What were the root causes? We talked about this program called the Tax Increment Finance System, which was a system whereby money that would otherwise go to schools, parks, and libraries was being siphoned off into corporate welfare coffers. So Boeing and, you name it, United Airlines, Penny Pritzker's hotel chain, the Hyatt, was getting this money. And she's a billionaire who sits on the school board. So she's making these policies and signing off on these subsidies to her own corporation, a serious conflict of interest. So we blew up these things, and we created spectacles around them. And we brought a golden toilet to the Board of Trade because they were using this money to revamp their toilets. And we had a bake sale for the Board of Trade and the Mercantile Exchange because obviously they needed more money, so we wanted to sell some muffins on their behalf. And those things helped people re-envision their role in the union, and we took fake arrests. So we told the cops, we want to get arrested after this, and told them ahead of time. And the idea wasn't, we're getting arrested for real now, we're getting criminal trespass charges now, but it was baby steps. How do we bring our members along in a way that will gain confidence and creativity in how they see themselves in the union movement? So the last thing I want to say is how we recalibrated union structures once we came to power. One thing is we took the way we talk to members and revamped it significantly. Instead of talking about, how do you prevent an assault? Or, when you get assaulted by a student, how do you fill out the form? Or, what happens if you're charged with child abuse? Or, what happens if you lose a sick day? Those kinds of conversations. We really broadened it and tried to get at the nub of what was bothering people, because such a small percentage of people in our unions deal with the union on that basis. They don't get in trouble. 90% of people don't get written up, don't have disciplinary issues, don't confront an abusive principal. So we had to reshift the focus to the majority. And we used our phone bank machinery. We used our layer of members to train them up and our phone bankers to have those conversations so that they became better listeners. They became able to identify what really made people tick. And we based those positions on who was effective communicator, not on who were our friends, not who helped get us elected, not even who shared our politics necessarily, but who was able to really appeal to a broad group of people. And they got radicalized through that process, but they didn't necessarily start there. So to wrap up, and there's a lot more I'd like to say, but come see me afterwards if you have additional questions. A key to winning our strike and winning public opinion was indicting the educational system for its failure to address the inequities in the lives of the children that we serve every day. And this was a document, I have extra copies, so feel free to grab one. That was a touchstone document for our members in talking about those issues. Why do 40% of our schools not have art and music? Why do 96% of schools not have social workers? Why is it that we have the 5th largest class size in the state? So that was a language that our members really loved and cared about deeply, but it also resonated with parents. So that was critical. And last, I would say that the little I've heard being here about the dilemmas here in Toronto and in the province regarding teacher unions and the issues and hardships that you face right now, I still don't quite understand why the high school teachers and the elementary teachers aren't merged. Like we're merged in Chicago. And I think we have to get to a point where we're not just talking about, the ETFC walking out, but we're talking about North America walking out. And we're all facing the same threats, and we need to fight them with the same tools and the same militancy. So I welcome that conversation moving forward.
So I wanted to take maybe a less concrete approach here and talk about things at a bit more of a meta level. I think that sometimes we actually fetishize activism, right? And when I say that, I mean that we get really caught up in the forms of activism, the techniques, the loudness, for example, the demonstration, the sit-in, the street theater, all of these kind of clever things that are associated with activism. It comes to people's minds when we talk about activism. And I think that we need to look through that sometimes and really focus more on the goals of activism. There used to be a correlation, I think, between the techniques of activism that were used by people with little access to the traditional instruments of political power, right? So that's why we developed that kind of stuff. And so that meant the goals of that work was around creating a more equitable, a more humane, a more just society. But in this topsy-turvy world that we live in, we've seen the word activism take on all sorts of different meanings. When you open your morning newspaper or turn on your morning screen, no matter however people tend to do it, you'll hear people talking about Tea Party activists in the United States, right? Or anti-abortion activists, or anti-sex ed activists, or conservative party activists, right? So what exactly is going on here? What we're seeing here is that those traditional techniques of activism are in fact being used for the goal of entrenching privilege and maintaining the status quo. And that's not a kind of activism that I'm particularly interested in. I started working with the education system in the very late 70s, early 80s, and my job was to train and support and encourage student activists. The board had just passed quite a progressive anti-racism policy, and they had recognized, though, that passing a policy and launching a policy at the top wasn't going to have much effect unless people were actually pushing to see it implemented in a very concrete way on the ground. And so my job was to train and support and encourage student activists to do just that, to raise a ruckus in their schools, right, and make it really difficult for principals and administrators to simply ignore the policy. That policy, though, had also emerged from another kind of activism, a community activism among immigrant, racialized peoples, working class communities, who were demanding that something change in the way that their kids were being miseducated or not educated at all, right? And they could look at the stats and see what was happening, that people were passing or failing not depending on how hard you were working or how smart you were, but what part of town you lived in, right? And how rich your parents were. And they were the ones that demanded those changes, fought for different trustees, and produced these new kinds of policies that then we were working on the ground in the schools. So we had community activism and student activism, and of course, what we have to recognize is that when there is activism and push for change, there is also always resistance. Interestingly, in those very early days, there was enormous resistance from teachers and the unions to the new anti-racism policy, because it was considered that it was demanding that they reflect on and change attitudes and practices and pedagogies, and many people were comfortable with the way things were and did not want that kind of change. One of the biggest fights during the time I was at the board was around the integration of heritage languages during the class day. Huge opposition to that. So much opposition that another kind of activist actually managed to organize and turn over the balance of power in the board at one point. There was resistance from principals and administrators to, what would you call it, community involvement in their schools, because it meant giving up a certain amount of power over how they organized their schools. And personally, if I didn't have at least one screaming principal or superintendent on the phone every year telling me that I should be fired, I figured that I wasn't really doing my job, right? Today that might be called principal or superintendent activism, right? Because they were being loud, if loudness is your measure. So I think we can see here a kind of a contradiction among within activism as it's understood today, right? the traditional activism, which is about making things better for people who traditionally get the short end of the stick in the way society is organized, and another kind of activism that's aimed at protecting existing privileges. Another way of looking at that, I think, is self-centered activism, right? And activism around bigger than self issues. And I think it's important to make that distinction. And I'm using that terminology because it comes from a document called Common Cause. I don't know if people read it. It came out of the British environmental movement. And it's also based a lot on the work of George Lakoff, who's a social psychologist. What Lakoff and people in Common Cause argue is that bigger than self activism is based on and reinforces particular kinds of values. Values of solidarity, community, generosity, for example. Whereas self-centered activism tends to be based on and therefore reinforce values around self-interest, individuality, jealousy of what other people have. What Lakoff and his colleagues are arguing is that when values get activated and reinforced, they never actually stay on the issue in question. They tend to generalize. They go beyond the immediate issues at hand. So what they do is, in fact, change the way that people actually look at the world. What we're talking about here are competing worldviews, worldviews that really value notions of individuality and getting what's mine, and other worldviews that say, no, we have to work together because this produces a better world for all of us. Now, what does that mean in this topsy-turvy world, again, that we're dealing with, where we are not moving towards a more equitable society, but away from it, not moving towards more equality in our society, but towards greater disparity, right? If you look at any of the stats, that is quite clear. And not towards greater justice, but towards more and more injustice. It's been phrased in terms of this meeting as increasingly conservative times. I mean, that's what that captures, that we're moving in a very different kind of direction. Sometimes we find ourselves defending the status quo against the threat of worse, right? And that seems to be the most progressive stance that we're allowed to take, right? Which then begins to turn all sorts of things, make things a lot more complicated. Now, teachers, we're talking about teachers here, largely, tend to be fairly well organized, and therefore better paid, and have more job security than most of the parents of the students that we teach. And yet we know that teachers are under attack because the public education system is under attack, and therefore are getting active. So I think the real question that we have to think about is what kinds of values or what kinds of goals we bring to that activism. If we defend our salaries and working conditions using a kind of self-centered constellation of values, we will reinforce those same kinds of values around us, right? And that means that those who are doing a lot worse in these conservative times will see us as grasping and selfish and fighting to maintain our privilege. And they'll turn their backs on us, right? That's what will happen. If, on the other hand, we fight to defend public education to ensure more equitable educational outcomes, communicate that we have bigger than self values here, we will activate those kinds of values around us. Those kinds of values are contagious, and therefore we'll see solidarity in those communities. Now, this has got to be more than just spin, right? The Putting Students First Act, right, is an example of spin. I mean, the people who name these acts have read George Lakoff, right? They know what they're trying to do, right? It can't be just a matter of spin because, as we do, people see through spin pretty quickly, right, when they taste what's actually going down. So what we've got to do is really demonstrate concern about students in marginalized communities. We've got to be just as active on those bigger than self issues that affect other people as we are on our own. If we hope to see their solidarity, we've got to demonstrate ours. So it's certainly time for educational activism. The kind of neoliberal meat grinder, no matter which party hat it's wearing at a particular point, is certainly threatening teachers. It's certainly threatening public education. But we should never forget that it has already caused enormous devastation among the most vulnerable communities, the communities that we're supposed to be serving. So if we're going to be effective in protecting our working conditions, it means that we have to be effective in challenging those worsening, broader inequalities in societies. We have to be seen to be doing that, and we have to be doing it on the ground. We're going to be able to defend public education only if we're able to demonstrate that public education is a force for progressive values for those that need it most. Thanks.
I just wanted to start off, it's really nice to be back here at OISE. 2 weeks ago, I earned my Master's of Education, and can see a few of my professors that are sitting out there. So, I know they're going to be cautioning me to make sure I properly cite my research here. So, but it's nice to be in the library because we've spent a lot of countless hours here, and coming back as a teacher activist who's working in the inner city. But before I begin, I also would like to thank my colleagues from OISE here, OSSTF and ETT, and all the rank and file educators, not only for collaborating on tonight's event, but also for your courageous and principled reaction to the Ontario government, Liberal government's draconian measures enacted under Bill 115. Just a few weeks ago, two 26-year-old Somali men lost their lives violently in a social housing complex 200 meters away from the school that I teach at. The children had to walk over and under police tape in order to make it to school that morning. And, at the time I couldn't understand why the police had not cleared the crime scene before the children awoke so they wouldn't have to see such a gruesome sight. And so you see, for me, that's why I cannot be just a teacher, and I also identify as a community organizer in Etobicoke North. I am embedded in the struggles of the community to create a more just and sustainable society. And affected by its outcome, I do adopt an anti-oppression framework and am painfully aware of the enduring nature of social exclusion and socioeconomic educational realms, as is evidenced by much research, like the Roots of Youth Violence Report, the School Community Safety Panel Advisory Report, the Toronto District School Board Opportunity Gap Report. There's been 40 years of reports that have told us this. And so for me, that's why I see the yellow police tape as personified barriers faced by students I teach from getting the education that they deserve. And by social exclusion, I mean the systemic and structural processes that prevent certain groups and individuals from accessing resources and opportunities readily available to the more advantaged members of society. These exclusions shape inequitable outcomes for young African Canadian, English-speaking Caribbean, and Latina youth. And while I see it in my classroom, I also recognize that the inequitable outcomes are replicated across our city. So that's where I'm located. But for this space that we share here today, I want to talk about the silence. I think, our previous two, both Jackson and Tim, talked about it, the kind of silence among teachers regarding economic inequality. We as teachers live in a city where 1 in 3 Torontonians are living under the poverty line. And so I'd like to talk about that, but I will also share with you some of the organizing experiences that I've shared with some of our ETT members. I see a few of my executive members that are here today, sitting down here and throughout the crowd. So Speaking with many classroom teachers across the city, it's my opinion that many of them are unaware of the roots of economic inequality. They do not see it as a problem for them. They do not identify with the shrinking middle class and do not see economic inequality as an urgent problem. And here's why that's a problem. Our ability to understand economic inequality will determine our capacity to respond to it. However, this ability to analyze and understand the current situation is hampered by attitudes, policies, and institutions that offer coded, racist explanations for our economic and social problems. The prevailing myths about our class-less society and the belief that our economic system is fair and open to any person who is willing to work hard, or the North American dream of economic prosperity for all, is often associated with democracy and our political system of representative government. This equation of democracy to capitalism confuses political and economic discourse in such a way that critiques of the economic order are immediately perceived as opposing democracy itself, thus preventing consideration of alternative economic policies and structures. The psychological investment most Canadians have in multiculturalism makes it difficult to challenge and address these issues clearly. During periods of economic and social upheaval, and in the absence of a framework for thinking clearly about the economy, people often turn to scapegoats. Thus, the underlying factors that create vast inequalities of wealth and the beneficiaries of these policies remain largely obscure. Instead, public service sector workers are blamed for bursting the province's budget. Foreign-born workers are blamed for taking away jobs. Working women, gays, and lesbians are responsible for the breakdown of the nuclear family and the moral decay of society. Asian and European economic interests are blamed for stealing resources, and the government spending is targeted as the source of most economic woes. Policy debates center around deficit reduction or getting tougher on illegals, while constructive proposals such as restoring taxes on the wealthy or investment in rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure are dismissed as class warfare or special interest peddling, the tax and spend attack on the progressive left. This is why we as teachers need to be naming this problem, naming it amongst ourselves, with our students, and with our parents. This is also tactically smart because it gives us an avenue to build social movements with our students and their parents. So now I'd just like to share with you just some of the examples of organizing that, while they're not as like the level that we've heard of going on in Chicago, I think it's a start. In the 2008-2009 school year, Community Organizing for Responsible Development, CORD, developed a community organizing group originally founded through the work of Unite Here 75. Now, Unite Here 75 works primarily with hospitality workers in Canada and the United States, and through its experience, it came to recognize the importance of local community organizing to ensure good, secure jobs for residents of marginalized communities. In Rexdale, CORD was founded by 2 staff members of Unite Here 75. They built a coalition of community members, activists, and labor organizations that work together to address social and economic inequality. CORD's initial work concerned mobilizing residents in response to the proposed Woodbine Racetrack redevelopment project. Through 2 years of organizing, including surveys, community meetings, advocacy campaigns, a community benefits agreement was negotiated. The community benefits agreement included ensuring local hiring, as well as the provision of a training facility so that community residents would have the necessary skills to qualify for the jobs. In 2011 school year, members of the ETT Political Action Committee and some of our executive members were commiserating regarding Rob Ford's mayoral win and the looming provincial elections at the time that had the Tim Hudak Conservatives with a double-digit lead in the polls. At the same time, a cell phone photograph of a TTC collector asleep at his booth hit the front page of the Toronto Sun. The photo sparked a media frenzy for the gotcha-style photos and videos of frontline TTC staff working, taking washroom breaks and coffee breaks. A number of these pictures were published in the Toronto and national press. Borrowed from that experience, the Amalgamated Transit Union 113 and their Let's Talk series, the ETT and these PAC members and executive members created what we called the Community Education Action Plan. The purpose of the initiative was to build support for ETT in preparation for the 2011 election and negotiations of 2012, with a special focus on building support for teachers through public forums and community organizing, emphasizing issues from the perspectives outlined in the ETFO document, Building Better Schools platform. The platform highlighted 5 building blocks for better schools: 1, more meaningful student assessment, 2, greater access to specialist teachers, small class sizes for elementary students, more resources for special needs students, and a greater focus on equal opportunity and inclusion. The initiative led to 2 public forums that were held both in Etobicoke and Scarborough that were well attended by students, parents, and teachers. ETT has now built on the work of the initiative to form a standing committee called the Committee for Community Outreach. And as a result of this work, a new alliance is emerging between parents, teachers, and students in these communities. More recently, another group of teachers, high school teachers, and elementary teachers have collaborated on a number of initiatives that included a grade-in that took place at Dundas Square. A large number of teachers sat together doing their marking while at the same time spoke to the public about many issues facing teachers and students in education. That was closely followed by a rally at Queen's Park that was to celebrate the marriage of Dalton McGuinty and Tim Hudak. But unfortunately, the Liberal government prorogued the legislature before they could exchange their vows. Other work of the rank and file education workers of Toronto, or ROOT, as we are now called, include door knocking, pamphleting, and also an online blog. So please be sure to sign up to our listserv to keep in touch, and there's a number of our members that are sitting out here in the audience. The beneficiaries of the upward redistribution of wealth are rarely held accountable and refusing to act responsibly. It is my hope that our discussion today will explore the consequences of economic inequality and look at the true beneficiaries of wealth redistribution and examine the underlying factors that contribute to persistent inequality in our country, and at the same time consider strategies and campaigns for creating a more just and healthy society. I'd like to conclude my comments by acknowledging the many teachers here. You know, you've bought boots for our students who had none. You supply books, you've given up your lunch to students, and you've spent a lot of your own money on your classrooms to try to provide a great experience for your students. But in these increasingly conservative times where you as teachers are being held as the scapegoat for the financial breakdown of the province, we have a responsibility. We have a duty to democracy and to our future generations to shine a light on the true root of the problem. And we can take a look at our parents and grandparents for examples, for inspiration. Because here in Canada, less than a century ago, women did not have the right to vote and were considered the property of men. But a small group of women called suffragettes organized and won the right for women to vote. Here in the 60s, we had many people from different communities, from blacks and whites, from many progressives that came together and beat back racial hatred and won civil rights for all. And prior to 2008, anyone who said that a black man would be president of the United States would have just laughed. And just this summer, you know, we saw Quebec students go on strike, and many mocked them. Many vilified them in their protest against increased tuition fees and said that they would be achieving nothing. But the result of their action led not only to the fall of the Charest government, but it also canceled the tuition hike, the repealed an anti-protest law that curbed basic freedoms of expression and assembly, and it put a moratorium on fracking and mining in the province. So you see, tonight can be the start of our own movement, our very own Maple Spring here at OISE. Let future historians look at tonight as the igniting of of Toronto's newest education movement. One love.
He's out. He's out. They finally booted the beep beep a-hole out, announced Xander, one of the 15-year-old students, out into the hustle and bustle of the main classroom. All of a sudden, everything was in a hush. Everyone turned and looked to each other. And then suddenly, it started with one, and then the other, and each student in a resounding soul clap until the whole main classroom space thundered in applause. This was my Monday morning. I believe in thinking, and the theme of educational activism is in starting where you are, acting in the moment, looking at examples of educational activism in the classroom as it sprouts. Like, for example, what happened with Xander yesterday in our classroom. And for me, that was a brilliant example of social activism in action, you know? The fact that the student felt that he could, act on his free, his rights to free speech. The fact that the students could celebrate in that celebratory moment together, for me as an educator, was an enriching and rewarding one. And I'm really happy to share the stage here with Jackson, Tim, and Nigel, because for me, being an educator here in the city, I've worked mostly through alternative education, and sometimes I feel that it can feel, I feel that I'm sometimes stuck in a bit of like a silo, thinking that it's very different than what's happening outside in kind of mainstream schooling and whatnot. But hearing the words from my other colleagues up here is really heartening, and to know that we're all kind of on the same, we all share a similar vision, and and how to achieve that. And really resonated with me when Jackson was talking about the idea of the importance of building those relationships, and starting at the union level. And for me, I believe that educational activism is the firm foundation is relationships, is about building those relationships, because if you look at the whole neoliberal climate that we live in, I feel that relationships is its antithesis, right? It's about breaking people and setting people apart, is by putting people into silos and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to mention, and I also want to honor, through the presentation that I'm going to be giving, the people who have helped me put this presentation together, which isn't just myself, and taking into consideration the many voices of students that I spoke to, the students that I spoke to, the other educators in my life, administrative and community members, that when I had the chance to be able to come up here and speak, that it was really important for me to get their opinions as well too, in terms of what can be shared, so that we can try to reach as many people as possible as we move forward. So the way that I've kind of broken it up is my own, I guess, history in social activism is one that I've started since I was a child, and I was really lucky. I come from immigrant parents who immigrated here in the 70s from South America, and along that wave, a lot of people who came for political reasons. So I grew up in a very political or politicized family, and obviously it's what affects the work that I do now. And so, I want to draw upon the experiences as a high school educator right now, working at Alpha 2 Alternative, as well as my involvement with Proyecto Latino, which is a joint initiative between the TDSB, the Center for Urban Schooling, and the Toronto Latino community, and as well as my recent work with the Aboriginal Education Center through the TDSB. And the loose framework I want to work with is that idea of working on relationships. Relationships that can happen between teacher and student, the relationships that happen between teacher, parents, and community, of the relationships that happen between teachers, colleagues, and administration. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges in educational activisms in the classroom and outside, and then maybe if we have enough time, talk about some future steps and maybe some practical ideas that that we can all kind of leave with and hopefully be able to step into and consider for the future. So starting with teacher-student relationships, after talking to the students that I'm blessed to work with right now, you know, for a lot of them at the high school level, you know, even asking them, you know, what does social activism means to you? I mean, there's a lot of many ways to define that, you know, even as Tim has described for us, and it means a lot of different things to people. I know in the case of the students that I spoke to, they said, you know, activism for me is somewhere where I feel like I have a chance to have my voice be heard, where people actually care about what's happening to me, what's happening to my community, what's happening in my life. In terms of one of the examples that I can share about how we try to work that within our classroom environment is the way that the philosophy works at our school, which is based on self-direction and on consensus-based community decisions. So how that basically works is that the student is really placed in what I believe is, you know, the respectful role that they should be in, which is, you know, basically, you know, a master of their own desires for learning and for life. And it's them who decide how they want to learn and what is the best way that they can learn. And we, as adults, if anything, kind of take more of a backseat and basically just, you know, facilitate and help in whatever way we can. One way that you know ends up turning into how students then are able to come to decisions that would then affect the community of the other students in the space is through weekly student meetings that the students have, which they all look forward to. I'm just laughing because I have a couple students here in the audience. And it's an opportunity for all the students to come together to have their say on any kind of issue that would affect the school community in any way. And what's unique about it is that the decision making that is made is through consensus. And consensus is different than democracy or participatory democracy in that no final decision is not made through a vote. It's basically made more based on the principle that all voices are allowed to be heard. And if there is any kind of dissent or any person who feels uncomfortable with whatever decision is being made, then we do not go forward until those concerns have been raised and have been listened to and vented, and sometimes decisions, you know, will be put on hold for weeks and weeks, for months, sometimes years, you know, forever. But what is really valuable about the consensus-based decision making model is that, you know, in the end, it's not necessarily about having to adhere to this kind of product-driven, you know, consumer kind of, you know, we want this and we want it now kind of reality, but the real, like, kind of meat and bone works of actually talking things out and trying to work through things out and the difficulties that arise from that. So that's one example that that I wanted to share in terms of, you know, how something like a simple act like that can be brought into a classroom. And this is something that I think that in a mainstream space can happen as well too, in any classroom, you know, creating those spaces, and those decisions can be made even in terms of involving the students on what the curriculum is even going to be like in that classroom, of what is it that they really want to be learning. Can be something that can be really valuable. Tying into that is that when you are, you know, trying to make these decisions as a community, you know, a little thing called conflict, you know, often arises, and conflict is, you know, it's a part of life. It's also part of the reason why we're all here today, talking about how, you know, it's all these bigger world conflicts that are, you know, affecting us and pushing down on us. That have brought us here in the first place. And again, for me, you know, I really, more and more, I'm really trying to work with what's small, what's tangible, what I can really feel and work with. And for that, I would say, is how do we work through conflict? And through the work that I've been, again, blessed to be a part of, and a lot of it has been happening through a lot of different, like, Aboriginal First Nation communities that I've been blessed to have been able to learn from elders, through people through the Aboriginal Education Center here at the TDSB, and that's been through restorative circles. And I also believe that there is a great value in learning more about the Aboriginal worldviews that are here, existing here in Canada, and in which all of us, at some point or other, we all have like a heritage and a lineage that we can draw upon. But again, if we are to be linking it to the idea of educational activism, is a really, really important, critical piece that I think should be present in every single classroom in Toronto and at every level, and that is exploring and learning more about the Aboriginal worldviews of here, of where we are and the rest of Canada, and not just learn about it in terms of like, oh, this is just the history and these are the traditions and the culture, but actually adopt some of the amazing practices that that they have and that they are willing to share with us, so that we can actually maybe move through all of this conflict and this political situation that we're in right now, right? So again, that's another suggestion, and in terms of that, depending on, I'm not sure what, in terms of the teachers who are here, what board they might be from or whatnot, but an excellent resource for that for the Toronto District School Board would be the Aboriginal Education Centre, and I would recommend that you get in touch with them, and they have like amazing access to elders and to teachers who are more than happy to come in to your classroom and to work with you and your students. The last example I want to draw upon is the work that I've been doing with Proyecto Latino, which, as I mentioned, was a joint initiative between the University of Toronto, the Toronto District School Board, and the Latino community. Here again, I think what's really important as a teacher is, again, it's not about like as Tim had mentioned, that really resonated with him, those big acts, right? Of like when you think of educational activism, is it's like, yeah, like chaining yourself to a tree, or like the street theater kind of stuff and whatever. Not to say that those things aren't valuable and there's a place for everything, but to think about the small radical acts that can happen in your classroom. And one of them can really be is just, ask your students, care about what is the demographic that you're serving? What are their, the local issues that are important to them? So instead of in terms of, doing the whole go to a soup kitchen, helping out for, Christmas or something like that. Maybe take them on a trip to Occupy Now, which is what we did last year, or we're having a trip actually tomorrow. We're going to the Toronto Women's Bookstore, which unfortunately is closing after 35 years of existence, but some students, it was really important for them to want to be able to visit it at least once, So again, really, I think, by just talking to the students, finding out where they're at, what their interests are, what the demographic is, and within that, there's the idea of the cultural relevant pedagogies that, can play into that in terms of speaking to, how they learn and what they want to learn. And that's what Proyecto Latino was about. It was about a community initiative that actually was started by the Latino communities who wanted to respond to the fact that there was a 40% dropout rate for Latino students here in Toronto, and they were really worried. The parents, the students, the educators, the community, and that's, I think, the best kind of activism. It's when it actually comes from the community itself, and the educators tried to work with that. And now we are almost 4 years later. We are still working on that project and trying to find new ways of involving more students and taking it also outside of just Latino students and trying to work with other demographics of students that are also being underserved in the system right now. So yeah, I mean, again, I have a lot more to say, but in terms of timing, I'll just leave it at that, of giving some examples. I guess, finally, I just wanted to end again with another student quote, because they're the ones that always kind of inspire me the most, and they're the ones who kind of get me up in the morning and excited about being at work and feeling that I'm learning and actually acting in the real world. And this one was a student of mine who was talking about the idea of how she even viewed what education should even be about. And what she kind of said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this, so I'm sorry if I don't get it completely right, Elo. She said, education shouldn't be about going to school like it's some kind of day job, like you punch in or you punch out. It should be a lifestyle. I should choose to go to school where I'm following the life that I want to live. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists. That was great. You've heard from 4 people who have different perspectives around this issue, and now is a time for Q&A. So we have 2 people with roving mics, Jeff Kugler and Fernanda. And we're going to take 4 questions at one time, okay? So for the audience, I want you to be understanding activists, because maybe not all your questions will get answered. And I also want you to be generous and brief activists so we can get to as many of you as possible. For the audience, for the panelists, if you can write down the questions that you want to answer, don't rely on my memory because it isn't what it used to be, okay? And so if you're ready now, put your hand up, and Fernanda or Jeff will grab you with the mic. And we'll take 4 at one time, and panelists get ready.
Hi, my question's for Jackson. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about more about CORE. Choose one of these 2. How it organized within the union, and then how did it reach out to all these neighborhood groups, or did the neighborhood groups reach to you? How did that work?
Hello? I haven't got a question. I just wanted to add something. I think what was missing in the discussion so far is a frame that puts all of this in one little nice little box. And I think when we need to look at this movement, is the microphone on? It's like a worldwide movement of conservatism. And what we need to look at is what is the overall structure that's affected this. And the specific thing is GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Because right in there, it ties us together that says education is actually a commodity, which means at some point in the future, the Americans or the Chinese can come to Ontario and say, hey, you're subsidizing education. We need to get back to it. We need to get rid of that. So that is a specific thing we need to address. We need to inform our citizenry of the broader picture. Like, for example, what we're looking at is actually an attempt to turn the clock back, which was started with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And so we need to look at what is it. I mean, I can go on forever, but I need to stop. So I just want to say we need to give the overall picture. So regardless of governments in power, we're still going to have the same problem. So it's not a conservative liberal issue. It's an overall problem.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. I'd like to know more about the community benefit agreement package and how that process worked.
Thank you. And one more?
I'd like to know from Jackson, you talked a little bit about the debate that happened between community groups and unions in terms of marching on the mayor, and I'd like to know more about that process and what about it made it productive and a strengthening, unifying sort of approach.
Okay, panelists?
Should I start?
Sure.
So I'll kind of merge the questions here. CORE started with 6 people. I don't know if people are aware of that, but it was a small group that became a big group fairly quickly because we were hitting issues that were affecting the membership and really captured their imagination. And one of the first things at Englewood when they were closing my students actually emerged as people wanting to fight the hardest, and they organized a walkout. And so all of a sudden I have 2 community people in my classroom the day these students are doing their walkout, and that's how I actually got to know a lot of people that ended up being in our coalition, was through the work, doing the praxis on the ground and fighting against these policies. And you know, part of also, you know, this process of how we had these debates is we just had praxis. We would have to sit down as activists and talk about what is our strategy and how do we bring our members along with us to fight against the school closings and articulate how the destabilization has occurred as a result of closing a school, sending those students like they're pawns on a chessboard to another school, destabilizing that school, and there's this huge domino effect, and the lack of investment in telling that story. And so those debates were, how do we invoke a strategy? And so when we came into the union, the people who were the most critical in helping us understand how to fight back were the community organizations that were in the lead. And so it was necessary and important to us to ensure that that relationship continued. So we formalized it through this community board that meets once a month. And you know, every month we come together, about 22 different organizations and a few unions, and debate out what's our next step. You know, what are the actions we're taking? What's our 6-month strategy? And those things really shape our overall strategy regarding many of these issues. Not all of them, but many of them.
I guess specifically to the question around community benefits agreements, and there's theoretically there's a large body of research on it, but how it happened concretely here in Toronto was really, you know, we met at my parents' house in Rexdale, and we would meet like on a Saturday morning, and we had our clipboards. I took some from my classroom. We had made out a number of questions that we were going to ask at the door, like what kind of community do you want? And we knocked on at least 5,000 doors throughout the process. Not, you know, we collected the surveys, and then from the surveys we then, you know, at nighttime we would call people back and say, hey, we're having this thing over at the library, will you come over? And so they would come. We sent letters to the editor. This was shared work. It wasn't one person. We sent letters to the editor. People would come out. When we had like almost 600 people in the West Humber Auditorium, it's a high school in a neighborhood. We had 600 people there. The counselor actually showed up because one of their people must have said, you need to get down here. And she came, right? And so that all of a sudden, again, like what Jackson's talking about, there's these moments that all of a sudden shift where people develop agency and they realize, wow, my vote, my voice actually does count. And so with the help, but that help came also with the investment of these are where labor can make a play, right? Because labor paid for paid staff to be with us, right? So the paid staff took the action items in between meetings and they made sure those things happened. And that's how that got developed. And there's another great opportunity for that to happen right now. Metrolinx, we have an $8 billion investment happening here in Toronto right now. And there's a great opportunity for us to organize and go, as educators, go out in the community and do the very same type of process. And to the very first comment, yeah, we're fighting neoliberalism, but we have to meet people where they're at. It's, you know, if we go and take a hammer and hammer over their heads and say, you know, why aren't you waking up? Like, that's not going to be helpful either. People, you know, in communities like where I'm working, like we have single moms that are just like, they're putting food on the table, you know, working 3 jobs. They're doing what they can to make sure that they feed their family. And so we got to meet people where they're at.
Can I just add one thing to the community piece that I think may be of value to you? So we were more of a big tent focus when we were a caucus, and anybody who could come to the table and had a community organization was welcome if they shared our basic values. We became much pickier and more strategic once we moved into a formal arrangement as the union, and it was based on, could you actually turn out members? It was more of an Alinskyist principle in terms of that basic question. And that was important because you had a lot of people with many opinions, and strong ones at that, who had no base. And they take up a lot of space and time, and they take up a lot of your energy. So consider that as you move forward.
Good. 4 more questions.
As someone who's done a lot of activism for socioeconomic and environmental justice, I couldn't agree more with this principle that you have to get people starting where they are. But I think it's a real loss. I do a lot of anti-classism workshops with teachers, and I'm struck by the most basic forms of political and economic illiteracy and their inability to make a connection between why someone who's working 2 jobs still can't actually put food on the table and what's going on in these broader processes. Now, I well understand, so there is a question coming, I promise, I won't be much longer. I well understand that ranting against capitalism and neoliberalism is not really a good organizing strategy, but my question is, what would it take for us to help progressive educators, teachers in particular, have stronger political and economic literacy of the kind that the Metro Network for Social Justice used to really champion in the 1990s, so that they can make those connections between community on-the-ground problems and the broader processes and not be left with no explanation for what's happening to us.
Thanks. Another question?
Hi there.
Hi.
So at least as I see it, it seems to me that unions for quite some time have become, at least for the last little while when they call it labor peace, their goal has become, or they're more focused on deal making, collaborators and so on. And there's this assumption that you are collaborating in good faith. And so I come from Mississauga here, so it is quite different than it is here in Toronto. And from what I've seen over the past little while, since Bill 115, our members are relying on unions, which they haven't seen, or union delegates and union members they haven't seen for quite some time. So they're alienated, of course, but there's this reliance. They listen to the board on one hand towards policies and what they should do. They rely on the union. So it's one or the other. And they're happy with those decisions, you know. So the question then is, and it's along the question of the previous question, essentially, is that what do we do where we show them that, look, you cannot rely on agencies which are collaborating with people who may not be in your interests or even in the interests of public education at large. And I'm referring to specific policies at work and so on, that you stand behind it, that you use, that you bring in discussions of ethics and so on and so forth, and do not simply sequester your arguments towards monetary aspects, as Tim pointed out. I think this is a serious, serious issue. And then we get something going, so it becomes a daily issue, rather than these major meta-narratives, because that's how you take them on.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question about, well, in order to build solidarity for this movement, you need to get the message as far and wide, spread as far and wide as possible. And something that I find really frustrating is that the corporate media does everything possible to present the other side's perspective and to marginalize or not present the perspectives that you're presenting to us here. And so I'm wondering, what can you do or what can we do to get the message across, to kind of circumvent the corporate media, if that's even possible, to get these messages out, because otherwise we're only hearing the arguments against what you're saying, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And then a fourth.
My question is about the media. The media has a tendency of dividing people all over the place. I think that plays a role as well. This is why we're all divided, and we need to get the communities back together and fight for what is right. And that's another area that we really need to look at. Thank you.
Thanks. Panelists, you want to respond?
Tim is being pretty quiet here, but one of the talents that he has also, in addition to being a book writer, he's also a videographer, and he has this outstanding video on Vimeo about neoliberalism. and the balloon. I don't know if anybody has seen it yet, but if you haven't, please Google it, get it, download it, show it to your, as teachers. It's a great teaching tool. As community organizers, it's an outstanding tool. I've been very appreciative of using it in many different spaces. In about some of the things that we might talk to our fellow colleagues about could be maybe organizing book clubs on Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, right? So that could be a good starting point where maybe our labor organizations purchase the book for everyone for Christmas, and we say, we're going to do like online and do that kind of approach. Also, in regards to the media, like there's Brandon. Brandon's in here, and he's like tweeting right now, like a madman with his fingers. And there's, I don't know how many Twitter people are out here, but what we're finding now is that the media actually, corporate media is going to Twitter to look at what's going on. And I don't know if people are familiar with it, but there's some, if you hashtag OSSTF or ETFO or ETT, you're going to find that there's a lot of people already communicating. We can build this to go around the corporate media, because I agree that if we're counting on them to spread our message, then that's not going to be part of it. And also, if you remember, like, again, going back to our parents and grandparents, they didn't have these tools. We've got them right now, and our children that we teach use them. And I just want to stop, paint on all of this. Yeah, we've got like our progressive left, and I define that as, from our liberal brothers and sisters all the way over to our anarchist brothers and sisters, that there's many of us that walk in the similar spaces, and we have to find a way to come together. You saw what happened. I don't know if any of you followed what happened in Calgary yesterday, where the Wild Rose candidate representing the Conservative Party this time just barely squeaked by. And I think this, we all have one vote each as citizens. We have to find a way to re-enfranchise ourselves on the left and find a way to use that vote as one of our strategic weapons. Not the whole thing, but one of them.
Thanks.
It's ironic that as educators we promote constructivism and learning by doing, the Deweyan principles. And then, when we're in the left, we talk about things in arcane language and verbose dissertations. And so I think we have to really use our pedagogical knowledge to help ourselves expose these things, and that speaks to how do we defeat the corporate media. We did grade-ins in Chicago at banks, Bank of America to be specific, and because we were trying to find strategically where is the intersection between our enemies and those, and where they're benefiting financially from the schools. And so identify your targets based on that, not whichever acronym is the global villain of the moment, but what's going to help you articulate a populist message and show people, through these spectacles, through a campaign of popular education, that their interests are tied in with your own. And when we went on strike, we used some of these popular tactics. We have tens of thousands of people in our unions that have deep roots in their communities that are going to be way more persuasive than some soundbite on TV that a corporation purchases. And we're not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with them in terms of their buying power, but we sure as hell better beat them on the ground. And so mobilizing, engaging, energizing, and spreading our message far and wide. We did a 30,000 person canvas when we were on strike. We didn't just stand in front of our workplaces with picket signs. We also went to the Board of Trade. We picketed in the morning, and then we sent thousands of people to the Board of Trade, and then that became the news story. How can you not cover 20,000 people shutting down traffic for 3 hours in downtown Chicago? So we have to start using our bodies strategically as well to articulate this populist message. And I think there's a tendency to go a little too far in terms of attacking sort of the backroom deal nature of unionism. That's part of this institutional culture of collective bargaining. Unless we're ready for a revolution, that's not going to be completely altered at the moment. And so there's a pragmatic side of unionism, and then there's an aspirational side. And we have to try and do both, because one without the other really leaves people even more vulnerable than they already are. And so, and that ties into an analogy, we have to be both the military and we have to be the town hall. So democratization is an important way to involve members, but there has to be an acknowledgement that leadership is critical as well.
Any other panelists want to weigh in?
In terms of the media, it's not just getting on the media, but it's trying to think really critically about what kinds of values you're promoting when you are getting your 2 minutes because you've managed to organize some very clever demonstration or something that actually made them pay attention. One of the things in this document called Common Cause that they pointed out in terms of producing people's worldviews, they talked about the amount of advertising that children especially see every day. And they had some very convincing studies that showed that if you watch this much advertising, what it does is produces these self-centered values, right? Because it's all about getting, right? And that when that frame is the default frame that's been pounded into kids' heads, that's the frame that they will bring to all issues throughout their lives, right? How do I get more for me? Which is exactly, this is the whole neoliberal worldview, right? Margaret Thatcher's famous statement, there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals, right? So an example that I was trying to think through, I picked up this flyer at a demonstration or something, it was around the nuclear industry, and they were talking about all these billions of dollars that are being poured into nuclear energy when there's all of these sustainable energy systems that could be much more effective in the long run. But their line was that taxpayers' dollars, you the taxpayer, your dollars were being wasted on nuclear energy. And I thought, well, okay, now what is this actually doing, right? Who's being spoken to here? Are we being spoken to as human beings that have to deal with an environment? No, we're being spoken to as the taxpayer. And we all know the stories and the narratives that come out of people seeing themselves primarily as taxpayers, beleaguered taxpayers that want to pay as little tax as possible. And so I wondered whether this progressive campaign in attempting to limit expansion of nuclear power wasn't in fact reinforcing the same kinds of values that were going to get progressive campaigns in trouble in a whole bunch of other areas. So I think that we always need to kind of really think through these kinds of things. How are we addressing people? What kind of values are we promoting? How is this going to affect their take on a whole range of other issues?
I just wanted to add in terms of the comment that you made earlier on about the challenges of the starting where you are and working in situations where you're surrounded by colleagues and people who are either at your level and also administration people or in levels of authority that are lacking in that critical literacy in terms of equity and whatnot. And I can feel you because I have been in that position. I am in that position, and it can be incredibly frustrating and has affected me as an educator navigate my role as one, and also even in terms of my own quality of life, in choosing to be an educator. And again, the one thing that I can only share with you in terms of how I'm trying best to deal with it, and it is kind of just step by step and kind of trying to practice what the tenets and the foundations of the philosophy of education that I believe in, and it is about that idea of honoring the self-direction in each person and that ability for individuality, but bringing it, and sharing our opinions in a community where we can make decisions together as a consensus. And this has actually been really hard because even though we do this in the classroom environment, when it comes to even with my colleagues at our school, we have our own meetings sometimes that have to do more with kind of administrative things of how we do things. And and sometimes some of this equity literacy, we all come from different backgrounds and whatnot, and there's clashes, but I find that, again, the more that we kind of just try to break it down to really trying to understand each other and listen to each other, have those discussions, like Nigel was mentioning, the book club, I think that's such an incredible idea. Another kind of, I know it might sound simplistic, but I do believe that it is in those small things that I feel that I kind of get to know the people around me, and then that instead of kind of positioning myself against them in terms of who I am, what color I am, what gender I am, what sexuality I am, but more in terms of the common values that really bring us together in the first place. And I really do want to mention again that I believe that it's in trying to approach this way of new way of relating is something that is happening right now, and I think it's happening right now even in this room in terms of, obviously we all are here because we don't want to keep replicating these like archaic systems of power and privilege, right? And the way it's been functioning in the world up to now. And so obviously this new model or paradigm is emerging. And the thing is, we maybe don't have the exact words of how to describe or to define it, but it is. And, and within that new model, which is more of a fluid, creative way, it's like we're in that transition moment right now. There are a lot of growing pains. We don't really know. It feels uncomfortable a lot of the time. We're not sure if it's right or wrong, but I think that's what's happening. I do believe that in some ways, that's a positive side of me, that it's like a pendulum. We're swinging back in response to the political tightening climate around us, and I think this is a good thing. Even as bad as the whole Rob Ford, nightmare has been for us for the last couple years, I think there's been also a lot of good that's come out of it as well too. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you for your questions. We're going to be moving on from the Q&A because we know a lot of you want to talk to each other.